I'm Roger Gilley, professional surveyor licensed in Arkansas, Missouri. I'm with Consolidated Land Services. We're located right here in Mountain Home at 2113 Highway 62 East. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about surveying and how it relates to the transfer of land. And I'll start off by just giving you a little bit of background on the survey system that we're under, which was started in the early to mid 1800s. And the original equipment was something called a gunner's chain, which was 66 feet long, and they used a Jacob's staff compass to get their direction. And it was pretty primitive, but for what it was, they did a really good job of getting sections and the townships laid out for us, which is what our basis of all of our land descriptions and everything is. Since that original survey, there's been certainly a lot of advances in the equipment that we use. We went from that to a 100-foot steel tape and a transit, and nowadays we use almost totally electronic measuring equipment that not only measures distances but also measures the angles. And obviously it's a much more precise way to measure. And of course, from even beyond that, we now use the GPS system, which is global positioning system, uses satellites. A lot of people have what's called a handheld, which is something you can purchase for a few $100s at almost any place, sporting goods. And it gives you accuracies that are good to get in the general area that you need to be, probably 10 to 30 feet accuracies. And then as surveyors, we have what's called survey grade GPS. And it's costs several $1,000s for the system, uses some very advanced computer software, and it gives you centimeter accuracy, or accuracies within hundredths of a foot. And we utilize that quite often. It has its own applications. Some places it's not suitable. You do have to be able to get satellite signals to use it. So that's some of the limitations of the GPS. For residential surveys, typically those are properties that are within a subdivision on pretty small pieces of property. And usually what we're going to be trying to accomplish there is identifying the corners of those properties. They're normally 100 feet or maybe a couple hundred feet in distance, and you have a line of sight from one corner to the other. So usually a landowner or property owner will just need to know where those corners are at. And sometimes we need to identify if there's happens to be any encroachments. Farm surveys or rural surveys typically are much larger pieces of land, and the corners may be as a quarter mile apart or a half mile apart, and you typically can't see from one corner to the other. So in addition to marking those corners, we will also mark the lines between the corners, so that if, say if it's a farmer, he's going to build a fence, or if there's already a fence there, we can show and know the relationship between the property boundary and the fence that's there. So that's you know, usually a more extensive survey to accomplish one of the larger acreage. Commercial surveys, usually what folks are interested in is knowing what's on that piece of commercial property. If it's got a structure on it, they want to know the location of that structure. If it's got parking lots, they want to see where they're at in relation to the property boundaries. Utilities, and particularly underground utilities, in the case of where they're going to maybe add on or build a brand new building, they need to know that information, easement locations, things like that. So that's what a lot of times you'll run into on commercial surveys. Some architects will ask for elevation information, which is represented usually by contours. And typically on a commercial survey, we'll get a pretty detailed set of instructions from the buyer or the buyer's agent telling us what they need on that survey. Sometimes it's referred to as an ALTA, American Land Title Association survey, that has some very specific items that they are looking for. So that is correct. Elevation is a lot of times part of a commercial survey.
Yes.
They do. Those are not near as common as they used to be, but in particular, if a title company is asked to remove all exceptions from a policy, then a lot of times they'll ask for an improvement survey where we show the house and any kind of improvements that's on the property, fence lines, anything that they need to see to make sure that there's nothing to encumber that property. Properties that may or may not be in floodplains. Of course, FEMA has got what's called a flood insurance rate map that we look at here in Baxter County and many of the counties around that will show floodplains, a shaded area, but many times to know specifically if a house if the elevation of that house is actually above or below that floodplain, we do have to go in and perform what's called or prepare what's called an elevation certificate, which gives the floor elevation of the house, the land, the corners, the land around the corners of the house, and even the crawl space they look for in relation to the 100-year floodplain. Now, some areas do not have what's called a detailed study to identify what that 100-year floodplain is, and those areas you pretty much are going to have to rely on just the floodplain map to tell you what you got. On lot splits, if a property owner wants to cut off a piece of their property and sell it, or they're going to deed it to someone else, then lot splits are required, and there are some differences in the regulations between what is required within the jurisdictional area of the city of Mountain Home versus out in the county. And within the city, you pretty much are limited to splitting that piece of property into 2 parcels. And they have certain requirements they have to meet. They can't be what's considered a substandard lot, which has to do with the area of the property and the frontage on the street. And there's several things that are stipulated. Out in the county, that's also true, except that in the county they do allow you to do up to 4 pieces of property, as long as they're at least 5 acres in size and less than 10 acres. And it's still considered a lot split if your access and everything is provided for. So that's one pretty big difference between the city and the county. But in order to break off a piece of property or split a piece of property in 2, you do need to go through that process with either the Planning Commission in the city or the Planning Board out in the county.